My name is Emily, and the memory of this day, the most beautiful of my life, will remain with me forever. It was a Saturday in June, and sunlight bathed the quaint church of Saint Germain de Prés, where I was to marry Thomas, the man I had cherished for 5 years. The air carried the fragrance of freshly cut roses, and gentle music drifted from the church's open doors. In a small room behind the scenes, I adjusted my veil with a nervous hand in front of a full-length mirror, while my best friend Sophie helped smooth out the creases in my dress. My heart was racing, a blend of excitement and anxiety. After waiting so long for this moment, emotions surged within me. "You look stunning, Emily," Sophie said, placing her hands reassuringly on my shoulders. "Thomas will be astounded." I smiled at our reflection, grateful for her calming presence. We'd been close since high school, and she had supported me through life's turning points. Today was no different. Suddenly, a disturbance erupted from the entrance of the church, growing louder. Sophie and I exchanged uneasy glances. "What's happening?" I whispered, feeling a knot form in my stomach. Sophie opened the door a crack for a peek. "I'm not sure," she replied, looking puzzled. "There's a gathering near the entrance." My father, meant to walk me down the aisle, appeared, his face pale. "Emily, my dear," he said softly, "there's a problem." Before I could inquire, the door was flung open and Martin, Thomas's mother, stormed in, her face red with anger and her eyes alight with rage. "You," she accused, pointing at me. "How dare you?" Stunned by her forceful tone, I stepped back. "Madame LeBlanc." I stammered. "What's happening?" "Don't feign innocence," she screamed. "You took my emerald ring, the one for my grandmother." A heavy silence engulfed the room. All eyes were on me as my heart threatened to leap from my chest, now from fear and bewilderment. I don't understand," I murmured, my voice barely above a whisper. "I've never seen your ring, Madame LeBlanc." But Martin wasn't listening. Her accusations grew louder, echoing through the church. I heard the guests' uneasy murmurs, their anxious whispers. Thomas appeared at the door, his expression grim, confusion etched into his features. "Emily," he said tensely, "is this true?" My heart shattered at the doubt lacing his voice. How could he suspect me of this? "Thomas," I implored, tears welling up, "I swear, I've done nothing. I've never even seen that ring." But the damage was done. Doubt had crept in, reflected in Thomas's eyes and in those of our guests now gathered at the door. The next few minutes unfolded in a tumult of confusion and heartache. With Martin's accusations relentless, Thomas remained silent, caught between loyalty and skepticism, his gaze flicking between his mother and me. I felt cornered, trapped. How had this day, intended to be the pinnacle of joy, unraveled into a nightmare? Sophie tried to calm the situation, defend me, but her voice was lost in the chaos. My father stayed steadfastly by my side, his hand a protective presence on my shoulder. Finally, Thomas spoke, his voice cold, distant, unrecognizable as the man I loved. "Emily, if you took this ring, return it now," he said. "Otherwise, the wedding is off." His words hit like a physical blow. I was incredulous. Thomas, who should have been my husband in moments, was now threatening our union based on unfounded claims. "Thomas," I pleaded, tears flowing freely, "I swear, I don't have that ring. I've never seen it. How can you doubt me?" But my words seemed to vanish unheeded. Thomas's gaze was unwavering, influenced by his mother's accusations, perhaps by his own uncertainties. The guests were restless, their whispers speculative. Some sided with me, others with Martin. The wedding atmosphere, meant to be radiant with love and joy, had mutated into one of suspicion and condemnation. I felt alone, betrayed, humiliated. How could I prove my innocence? How could I convince Thomas, the man I loved more than anything, that I had done nothing wrong? Minutes ticked by painfully, each second deepening the chasm between Thomas and me. Our future, our dreams, and plans crumbled before my eyes. At last, unable to endure any longer, I made a choice. With all the dignity I could summon, I turned to Thomas. "If you can't trust me today," I declared shakily but firmly, "then maybe we shouldn't marry at all." A stunned silence fell over the assembly. I saw the shock on Thomas's face, but I couldn't relent. He needed to grasp the gravity of his mistrust, how deeply it cut. Without waiting for a response, I turned to my father and Sophie. "Take me away," I whispered. As we moved towards the exit, I heard Thomas call my name, but I didn't look back. My heart was shattered, my trust destroyed. The happiest day of my life had devolved into a harrowing nightmare. As I stepped outside, the sun touched my face, a cruel juxtaposition to the storm within my heart. I couldn't predict what the future held, but one thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same. I found myself at the church steps, my heart in tatters, my mind chaotic. The June sun, so promising moments before, now seemed indifferent to my plight. Passers-by glanced at me, curious about the bride crying on the church steps, a wretched sight, no doubt. Sophie held me firmly, guiding me away from the entrance. My father's stern face attempted to disperse the onlookers gathering. Inside, I could still hear the argument's echoes, Martin's sharp voice dominating others. "Come, Emily," Sophie murmured, "let's find a quieter place." I allowed myself to be led like an automaton to a small cafe nearby. The proprietor, noticing my state, quickly found us a secluded corner. As I collapsed into a seat, the tears I'd held at bay surged forth uncontrollably. How could he do this? I sobbed, hands trembling. How could he doubt me? Sophie wrapped me in a comforting embrace, whispering consolations I could barely discern. My father sat across, simmering with suppressed anger. "My dear," he spoke gently, "we know you didn't do anything wrong. That woman's unhinged, and Thomas, he should have defended you." While soothing, his words only magnified the ache in my chest. Yes, Thomas should have stood by me, believed in me, in us. Yet he hadn't. Suddenly, the cafe door burst open. Thomas stood there, breathless, eyes reddened. My heart leapt, a turmoil of hope and fear. "Emily," he said, approaching cautiously, "we need to talk." My father stood sharply, placing himself as a barrier. "I believe you've done enough," he growled. I placed a hand on my father's arm. Despite everything, I needed to hear Thomas out. Perhaps he would apologize. Perhaps he'd finally trust me. "It's okay, Dad," I said weakly. "Let him speak." Thomas approached, hesitation evident. Conflict raged in his eyes, torn between his love for me and familial duty. "Emily," he started, "I'm sorry about the church incident. My mother's very upset. The ring means so much to her." I couldn't believe my ears. After all that transpired, he was still defending his mother's actions. "And me," I retorted, voice choked with grief and anger. "Don't I mean anything to you? How could you think I'd ever take something?" Thomas averted his eyes, unable to meet mine. "I don't know what to believe," he confessed. "My mother is so convinced." It was the last straw. Pain morphed into icy rage. I stood, facing the man I thought I knew loved. "Your mother's sure?" I echoed incredulously. "What about me, Thomas? Are you not sure of me? Of my integrity? My love for you?" By now, other cafe patrons were openly observing our unfolding drama, but I was beyond caring. Only Thomas and I existed, and the vast divide growing between us. "Emily, please understand," Thomas pleaded. "This is hard for everyone. If you could just—" I didn't let him finish. "If I could what, Thomas?" "Confess to something I didn't do. Except being accused of theft on my wedding day." The tension was overwhelming. Sophie and my father could sense the tension building and were prepared to intervene, ready to act as things seemed about to spiral out of control. It was at that critical moment Thomas spoke words I never anticipated hearing from him. "Maybe if you just confessed, we could sort things out," he suggested in a voice barely above a whisper. Time felt like it paused as I gazed at Thomas, searching his eyes for a glimpse of the man I loved and trusted. But all I found was a stranger. Without conscious thought, My hand moved, and the slap resonated throughout the cafe, drawing startled looks from other customers. Thomas recoiled, stunned. His cheek reddened where my hand struck him. "How dare you?" I cried, tears streaming down my face. "How dare you ask me to confess to something I didn't do?" The silence that followed was overwhelming as Thomas stared at me, hand over his cheek, disbelief etched on his face. Then, in a heartbeat, his expression shifted from surprise to a fury I had never witnessed before. What happened next etched itself into my memory as the moment my world completely shattered. Thomas's hand rose, the motion playing out in slow motion, unreactive until his fist collided with my face, pain erupting across my cheek. I stumbled backward, caught narrowly by Sophie, while exclamations of shock and outrage from cafe patrons reached me as though through a haze. My father lunged at Thomas, pinning him against the wall. "You bastard," he roared, shaking Thomas like a tree. "How dare you lay a hand on my daughter?" The cafe owner intervened, pulling them apart and yelling, "Everyone get out before I call the police." Sophie was already guiding me toward the exit, shielding me from the horrified and curious stares of other customers. My father followed, casting Thomas a final, furious glance before slamming the cafe door shut. Once outside, the reality of what had just unfolded hit me like a blow. The man I loved, the man I was going to marry, had just struck me. Shock, pain, betrayal all swirled into a chaotic storm of emotions I couldn't unravel. "We need to go to the hospital," Sophie said, examining my cheek as it began to swell. But I shook my head.
"No,"
I whispered. "I just want to go home." My father nodded, understanding my need to escape from this place and its memories. He hailed a cab, and soon we were driving through the streets of Paris, leaving behind the church and the remnants of what should have been the happiest day of my life. The drive passed in heavy silence. I stared out the window, barely observing the lively streets of Paris, the bustling cafe terraces, couples hand in hand. Everything felt as though it belonged to a world I no longer was part of. When we reached home, Sophie helped me up the stairs, my legs shaking, energy drained. Once inside my apartment, I headed straight for the bathroom, needing to see for myself. The mirror reflected back a stranger, a woman with red eyes, smeared makeup, and a bruise forming on her cheek. My wedding dress, a symbol of joy and hope, now seemed like cruel irony. I slowly removed it, letting the white fabric fall to my feet, each movement a painful reminder, both physically and emotionally. Sophie knocked gently on the door. "Emily, do you need help?"
"No,"
I replied in a voice unfamiliar to me. "I just need to be alone for a while." I heard her retreating footsteps and her conversation with my father in the living room. They were worried. But at that moment, I couldn't face their concern or pity. I stepped into the shower, letting the hot water scour away my tears, and finally allowed myself to grieve. How had we ended up here? How could love morph into something so ugly, so painful so quickly? When I emerged from the bathroom, wrapped in a bathrobe, I found Sophie and my father waiting in the living room. They stood up when they saw me, anxiety plain on their faces. "My dear," my father began, "maybe we should go file a complaint," but I shook my head. "Not now, Dad. I can't face it now." He nodded, understanding, though anger still glinted in his eyes. Sophie approached, wrapping me in a gentle hug. "I'll stay with you tonight," she said, a statement, not a question. I nodded gratefully, more scared than I wanted to admit at the prospect of facing the night alone. As I lay in bed that night, listening to Sophie's steady breathing as she slept on the living room sofa, sleep evaded me. My mind relentlessly replayed the day's events. Thomas's doubt, his mother's accusations, the slap, the punch, each memory stabbing at my heart. As dawn began to break, casting light through the curtains, I made a decision. I couldn't let this day define my life. Yes, I had been a victim, but I refused to remain one. Somehow, I had to find the strength to move forward and rebuild. With that resolution, sleep finally overcame me, a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams, but sleep nonetheless. When I awoke, I had to confront a new day, a new reality, a reality where I was no longer a bride-to-be, but a woman betrayed, hurt, but determined to rise again. The next morning, I was woken by a beam of sunlight filtering through the curtains. For a brief moment, everything seemed normal. Then the sharp pain in my cheek brought back the truth. The previous day's events flooded back like a tidal wave, leaving me breathless. I sat up slowly, every movement feeling like a monumental effort. My reflection in the dresser mirror made me wince. A purplish hematoma spread across my left cheek, a cruel testament to Thomas's betrayal. Sophie still slept on the living room sofa. Silently, I left the room, not wanting to wake her. In the kitchen, I turned on the coffee maker, its familiar sound bringing a semblance of normality to what would be an anything but normal day. My phone, which I had turned off the day before, taunted me from the counter. I knew eventually I'd have to turn it on, face the outside world, but not now, not yet. The coffee brewed, its aroma filling the kitchen. As I watched it drip into the cup, trying to gather my thoughts. What should I do now? How would I explain what happened to my family, my friends, my colleagues? Shame and anger intertwined within me, leaving me confused and exhausted. Emily? Sophie's sleepy voice pulled me from my thoughts. She stood in the doorway, hair tousled, worry etched across her face. How are you feeling? I shrugged, words failing me in describing the whirlwind of emotions inside. Sophie came closer, enveloping me in a silent embrace, her simple act of love breaking the dam of tears I had held back since waking. I'm here, she whispered, gently rubbing my back. We'll get through this together. We stayed like that for a while, the kitchen silence broken only by the coffee maker's soft bubbling. Eventually, I pulled away, wiping my eyes. Thanks for staying, I said, my voice hoarse from crying. Sophie gave a sad smile. That's what friends are for, right? We sat at the kitchen table, each with a steaming cup of coffee, silence stretching between us, comfortable yet laden with unspoken thoughts. Maybe you should see a doctor, Sophie suggested, gently nodding towards my cheek. I shook my head. It'll be okay. It's just a bruise, I insisted. Sophie frowned, clearly disagreeing but not pressing further. She knew when not to push. What are you going to do now? She asked after a moment. That was the million-euro question. What was I going to do? My world had collapsed in a single day. The future I had imagined and planned was gone, like smoke evaporating into thin air. I don't know, I finally admitted. I guess I'll have to cancel the honeymoon, inform the guests that the wedding is off, face my family, my colleagues. The list of things to do loomed large and overwhelming. How could I explain what happened? The truth seemed too cruel and humiliating to share. You don't have to do everything at once, Sophie said, placing her hand on mine. Take the time you need. I nodded, grateful for her understanding, yet aware I couldn't delay the inevitable forever. With a sigh, I picked up my phone. It was time to face reality. As soon as I turned it on, it buzzed incessantly, numerous notifications appearing. Missed calls, messages, emails, mostly from family. And friends were concerned about not receiving any updates. A few messages came from Thomas, and my finger hesitated over his name. Should I read his messages? What could he possibly want to convey after what had transpired? Before I could decide, the phone rang, and my mother's name appeared on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. Hello, Mom. Emily, my God. Finally. We were worried sick. What happened? Where are you? My mother's questions came in a rush. I closed my eyes, searching for the strength to reply. I'm home, Mom, I said softly. I'm all right. It's just that the wedding is off. Silence followed on the line, then a hesitant voice. Canceled? But why? What happened, sweetheart? I glanced at Sophie, who nodded supportively. Taking a deep breath, I began recounting the previous day's events. Accusations from Thomas's mother, his lack of faith in me, and the confrontation at the cafe. When I reached the part about Thomas striking me, my voice faltered. My mother's shocked gasp made me realize the gravity of the situation. "Oh, darling," she whispered, her voice shaky with emotion. "I'll be right there." Despite my attempts to dissuade her, she insisted on coming. An hour later, she was at my door, her arms laden with shopping bags. "I thought you might not feel like going out," she explained, placing the bags on the kitchen counter. Her gaze lingered on my face, and I saw tears welling in her eyes. Without a word, she pulled me into a hug, holding me close like when I was a child. The day blurred with phone calls and visits. My father arrived shortly after my mother, an expression of anger and worry on his face. My brothers called, offering to confront Thomas, a suggestion I definitively declined, even as a small part of me found the thought appealing. Sophie stayed by my side, screening calls and managing visitors, ensuring I ate and rested. Her presence was a sturdy anchor amidst the emotional turmoil. Towards the day's end, just as I was feeling overwhelmed, my phone rang anew with Thomas's name displayed. The room stilled, my parents and Sophie watching for my reaction. My heart raced as I watched the screen, uncertain. "You don't have to answer," my father said gently. But I knew that to move forward, I needed this conversation. My hand trembled as I picked up. "Hello." "Emily," Thomas's voice cracked as if he had been crying. I'm so sorry. I don't know what overcame me." "Stop," I interjected, surprised even by the firmness in my voice. "An apology can't undo what you've done, Thomas." Silence filled the line, then a broken voice. I know, I ruined everything. But I have to see you. There's something you need to know." My heart leapt, wondering what he could possibly have to say. A part of me wanted to end the call, sever ties, but a smaller, persistent part sought answers. "I don't think that's a good idea," I finally replied. "Please, Emily," he pleaded. "Just once, after that, if you never want to see me again, I'll understand." I closed my eyes, evaluating the risks and rewards, finally giving into curiosity. "Okay," I conceded, "but not today and not alone." We agreed to meet the next day at a nearby cafe. Sophie insisted on joining, and I accepted gratefully. After hanging up, I turned to my family and Sophie, their faces showing both concern and support. "Are you sure you want to see him?" my mother asked, her voice tinged with apprehension. I nodded. "I need to know, to understand why all this happened." That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. What could Thomas tell me? What could possibly justify what had occurred? As dawn broke, I rose, resigned to sleeplessness, made myself a coffee, and sat on the balcony, watching Paris awaken. Threatening sky, reflecting my state of mind, filled with unanswered questions and apprehension. I prepared mechanically, selecting simple, comfortable clothes. Unlike the wedding dress I should have worn for our honeymoon, Sophie arrived early, her face showing worry and determination. "Are you sure you want to do this?" she asked again. I nodded, unable to articulate the complex emotional mix within me: fear, anger, curiosity, perhaps a lingering trace of affection. Everything was muddled in indescribable chaos. We headed to Café des Artistes, a small, secluded place where Thomas and I used to go. The choice of venue struck me as cruel, laden with happy memories that clashed painfully with current reality. Thomas was already seated when we arrived, his pale, drawn face revealing his lack of sleep. Upon seeing us, he stood awkwardly, unsure of how to greet us. "Emily," he said softly, his eyes lingering on my face and the still visible mark of his blow. Guilt and shame were evident in his eyes. "Thomas," I replied coldly, sitting down without extending my hand. Sophie seated herself beside me, offering comfort. An uncomfortable silence ensued. The waiter arrived to take our orders, providing a brief respite. Finally, Thomas drew a deep breath. "Thank you for coming," he began. "I know I don't deserve you to listen to me, but—" "Get to the point, Thomas," I interrupted. "You said you had something to tell me, so say it." He nodded, his hands nervously toying with his coffee cup. After what happened at the church and at the cafe, I went home to my parents. I was lost, angry, confused, and then..." He paused, searching for words. I felt my heart accelerate, anticipating his next words. I found the ring, he finally revealed. The world stood still for a moment.
What?
I whispered, incredulous. My grandmother's emerald ring, Thomas continued, his voice barely audible. It was in my mother's room, misplaced. Anger rose within me like a tidal wave. Lost, I repeated, my voice trembling with suppressed fury. She accused me of theft, ruined our marriage, all because she misplaced her ring? Thomas lowered his gaze, unable to meet my eyes. I'm so sorry, Emily. I should have believed you. I should have. Yes, you should have. I erupted, attracting stares from other patrons. At that moment, I was indifferent. You should have trusted me, stood up for me. Instead, words failed, memories of the assault resurfaced, reviving pain and stigma. Sophie placed a calming hand on my arm. Calm down, Emily, she urged, then directed to Thomas. And your mother, what did she say when the ring was found? Thomas's face twisted in shame. She refused to acknowledge her mistake, claimed she might have put it there and forgotten, but asserted Emily could have taken and returned it. I was speechless. Even with evidence, this woman refused to admit wrongdoing. And you believed her? I inquired incredulously. Thomas shook his head vehemently. No, of course not. I had a massive argument with her. Told her her actions were inexcusable, that she shattered our marriage, our joy. He paused, running a shaky hand through his hair. I left their house, haven't spoken since. A heavy silence descended on our table. I stared at my coffee, processing this revelation. Part of me was relieved that the truth surfaced, my innocence established. Yet a larger part remained wounded, angered. Why? I asked quietly. Why didn't you believe me from the outset? Thomas met my gaze, remorse evident. I wish I had a good explanation, Emily. Truth is, I was a coward. Always struggled to defy my mother, you know that, and faced with her accusations, I panicked. I should have trusted you, recalled all we shared, but fear and doubt prevailed. His words resonated, revisiting past conversations about his troubled relationship with his mother. How many times had I urged him to stand his ground with her? Witnessed his discomfort at family dinners? That's no excuse, I responded. Thomas kept intruding on my thoughts. And nothing can justify what I did. Hitting you is inexcusable. I'll never forgive myself. Tears started forming in my eyes. You're right, I said softly. It's unforgivable. Thomas nodded, accepting my words. I know. I didn't come here to ask you to forgive me, Emily. I just wanted you to know the truth. You deserve at least that. We remained silent for a moment, each lost in our own thoughts. The cafe around us continued its activity, the conversations and clinking cups creating a peculiar backdrop to our personal drama. What are you going to do now? Sophie asked, breaking the silence. Thomas shrugged his shoulders. I don't really know. I've taken leave from work. I think I need to step back, think about everything, maybe even consult a therapist. I never want to be the man who raised his hand against the woman he loves again. His words touched me more deeply than I'd like to admit. Despite everything that had happened, a small part of me was relieved to see that he recognized the seriousness of his actions. And you, Emily, he asked softly, what are you going to do? I took a deep breath, realizing I hadn't really thought about that. The days had been a whirlwind of emotions and reactions, leaving me little time to consider the future. I don't know, I admitted. I suppose I'll have to officially cancel the wedding, inform the guests. And then there's work. I don't know how I'll explain all of that. I can help you, Thomas offered, with the cancellations, at least. I hesitated for a moment before nodding. Okay, but I'd prefer it if Sophie acts as the intermediary. I don't think I'm ready for any more direct contact with you at the moment. Thomas nodded in understanding. Of course, I understand. As our meeting came to an end, I felt strangely empty. The revelation of the truth should have brought me a sense of satisfaction or justice, but instead, I just felt tired and sad for everything that had been lost. We stood up, the heavy atmosphere of unspoken words and regret lingering. As we were leaving, Thomas made a motion as if to touch me but pulled back at the last moment. "I'm really sorry, Emily," he said one last time. "For everything." I looked at him, this man I once loved and thought I knew. Despite the pain and anger, I couldn't help but feel a hint of pity for him. "Goodbye, Thomas," I said simply before turning away. Sophie and I left the cafe, leaving behind not only Thomas, but also the shattered remains of what was supposed to be our future together. As we walked through the streets of Paris, I felt a weight lifting from my shoulders. The truth was finally out, my name cleared of any suspicion. Still, I knew the path to healing would be long. Broken trust, shattered dreams, and both physical and emotional pain would all take time to mend. However, for the first time since that fateful day in Paris, I felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe one day I could look back and view this event not as the end of everything, but as the start of a new chapter in my life. The days following my meeting with Thomas passed in a fog of reflection and introspection. The truth's revelation brought some relief, but also opened the door to many questions about my future. Every morning I woke up with a feeling of emptiness, as if floating between my old life and a new one that I couldn't yet envision. True to her promise, Sophie took care of the logistics of canceling the wedding. She handled the calls to guests, the caterer, the florist, sparing me the pain of having to repeat again and again why the big day wouldn't happen. I was infinitely grateful to her, even though each time she briefed me on her efforts. My heart tightened a little more. One morning, while having my coffee on the balcony and watching Paris awaken, my phone vibrated. It was a message from Thomas. "I started therapy. I know it doesn't change anything I did, but I wanted you to know. Take care of yourself, Emily." I stared at the screen for a long time, not knowing how to react. Part of me was relieved that he was seeking help and acknowledging his problems, while another part remained suspicious, wondering if this wasn't just an attempt to regain my sympathy. This message was the catalyst I needed to start seriously considering my future. Until then, I had been in survival mode, handling day-to-day emergencies. But it was time to make decisions. I decided to take a few days off to think. My boss, understanding of my situation, accepted without question. "Take the time you need, Emily," he told me. "Your work will be here when you return." On the first day, I went to the Luxembourg Gardens, a place where Thomas and I loved to stroll and discuss our future plans. This time, I went alone, a notebook in hand, determined to organize my thoughts. Sitting on a bench facing the large pool, I began writing my feelings, my fears, my hopes. Everything poured out onto the paper in a continuous flow. I realized how much I needed this moment. Through writing, one thing became clear. I couldn't go back. Even if Thomas was undergoing therapy, even if he changed, the trust had been irreparably shattered. The blow he had dealt left a far deeper scar than the now almost healed one on my cheek. On the second day, I had lunch with my mother. We sat on a small bistro's terrace, enjoying the spring sun. "How are you really, darling?" she asked, concern in her eyes as she scrutinized my face. I took a deep breath. "Better, I think. I'm starting to see things more clearly." She nodded, encouraging me to continue. "I don't think I can forgive Thomas," I said slowly. "At least not now, maybe never." My mother took my hand in hers. "That's normal, Emily. What he did is serious. You don't have to forgive him if you're not ready." Her words comforted me more than I anticipated. Realizing I didn't have to forgive or try to salvage a relationship that had hurt me so deeply at any cost was liberating. "What are you planning to do now?" she asked. I thought for a moment before answering. "I think I need a change of scenery, maybe take a sabbatical, travel a bit." The idea had sprouted in my mind the day before while casually leafing through a travel magazine. The image of a white sandy beach in the Seychelles made me dream of an escape. My mother smiled. "I think it's a great idea. You need to find yourself, rebuild yourself far from all of this." On the third day, I met Sophie at our favorite cafe. I shared my reflections, my desire to leave. "I'm proud of you, Emily," she said, hugging me. "Taking care of yourself is what's most important." We spent the afternoon exploring potential destinations, dreaming of adventures and new horizons. For the first time in a long time, I found myself laughing and projecting into the future with enthusiasm. On the fourth day, I returned to work, having made my decision. In my boss's office, I took a deep breath before speaking. "I'd like to take a sabbatical," I announced. "I need to step back, travel a little." My boss listened carefully, nodding with understanding. "I think it's a wise decision, Emily. How long do you plan to be away?" 6 months, I replied, surprised by my own boldness. "If that's possible." To my surprise, he agreed without hesitation. "You're a valued employee, Emily. Take the time you need. Your position will be here when you return." Relief and gratitude overwhelmed me. This conversation marked the concrete beginning of my new chapter. The following days were a whirlwind of preparations. I finally settled on the Seychelles as my first destination, with the idea of possibly exploring other countries afterward. Sophie helped me plan my itinerary, excited as if she was the one leaving. A week after my meeting with Thomas, I found myself in front of him again. This time, I requested the meeting. We met in a park, a neutral space. "I'm leaving," I announced abruptly. "I've taken a sabbatical. I'm going to travel for 6 months." Thomas looked at me, a hint of sadness in his eyes, but also understanding. "I understand," he said slowly. "You need that." I nodded. "Yes, I need to heal." A silence settled between us, heavy with unspoken words and regret. "I'm sorry, Emily," he said finally, "for everything. I hope you can forgive me." I looked at him. This man I once loved and thought I knew. Despite the lingering pain and anger, I felt a sense of peace enveloping me. "Maybe one day," I said slowly, "but not now. Now, I need to focus on myself." We parted ways. The day of my departure came sooner than expected, and standing on the station platform, preparing to take the train to the airport, I was surrounded by my family and Sophie. The farewells were emotional, yet laced with hope and excitement. "Take care, darling," my mother said, giving me a tight hug. "Enjoy yourself, but don't forget to keep us updated," my father added with a smile. Sophie hugged me last, whispering, "I'll miss you so much, but I'm so proud of you." As I boarded the train, my bag over my shoulder, I felt a lightness I hadn't experienced in weeks. The future was uncertain, but it was mine. I had made my decision to focus on myself, my healing, and personal growth. As the train slowly pulled away from the station, I looked out the window, watching Paris fade into the distance. A part of me felt sad, leaving behind so many memories, both good and bad. But a stronger part of me was filled with hope and anticipation. I had no idea what the next 6 months would bring, nor who I might become by the end, but I knew I had made the right decision. This journey was the first step towards my reconstruction, towards becoming a stronger, wiser Emily, ready to embrace life with a new perspective. As the landscape unfolded before me, I took out my journal and began to write, not about the past this time, but about the future, my hopes, dreams, and the things I wanted to achieve. For the first time in a long while, I truly felt free, the mistress of my destiny, and the adventure was just beginning. A month had passed since I left Paris behind, a life that now seemed to belong to someone else. Each morning, waking up in this paradise on earth, I felt a bit lighter, a bit more myself. The initial days were tough, despite the breathtaking beauty of the island. I felt lost, disoriented. The jet lag was just an excuse to mask the real gap I felt between the life I'd imagined and the one I now lived. But gradually, I started to embrace this new reality, spending my days exploring the island, losing myself in its lush forests, and swimming in its crystal-clear waters. Each evening, seated on the beach, I watched the sun dip below the Indian Ocean, its vivid colors seeming to carry away more of my pain. One such evening, I met Luc, a French photographer who had been traveling the world for years. We started talking, sharing our travel experiences and stories. Without realizing it, I found myself sharing my own story, a wedding that never came to be, betrayal, violence. Luke listened without judgment, offering only a sympathetic ear and a shoulder to cry on. That night, for the first time in ages, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Talking to a stranger, someone who didn't know Thomas or my life in Paris, had a cathartic effect I hadn't expected. In the following days, Luke and I continued to meet. He introduced me to photography, teaching me how to capture the island's beauty through the lens. I discovered a new passion, a way to express what I felt without words. One evening, as we sorted through our photos, Luke looked at me with a mysterious smile. "You know, Emily," he said, "I think you should consider extending your trip." I laughed, thinking he was joking, but his expression was serious. "I'm serious," he continued. "I have a friend who runs a diving center in Thailand and is looking for someone to help with administration and communication. It could be a great opportunity for you." At first, the idea seemed crazy, me, in Thailand, working at a diving center, so far removed from my Parisian life in finance. But the more I thought about it, the more it seemed to be exactly what I needed, a chance to completely reinvent myself, far from everything that reminded me of my old life. After several days of reflection and long conversations with Sophie over Skype, I made my decision. I was going to do it. I would extend my sabbatical and head to Thailand. Leaving Seychelles was both sad and exhilarating. I bid Luke farewell, thanking him for his friendship and for opening my eyes to new possibilities. He made me promise to send photos of my adventures in Thailand. Upon arrival in Bangkok, I experienced a culture shock. The spicy aromas, constant noise, and humid heat were all so different from what I knew. Yet, I strangely felt at home in this organized chaos. The diving center was located on a small island in southern Thailand. As soon as I arrived, Mark, Luke's friend and a French expatriate for over 10 years, welcomed me. His enthusiasm was contagious, and I found myself smiling more than I had in months. The initial weeks were intense. I learned the basics of diving while managing the center's administration. It was challenging but rewarding work. Each evening, exhausted yet satisfied, I fell asleep to the sound of the waves, feeling a peace that suited me. One day, while working on the center's website, Mark approached me with an unexpected offer. "Emily," he said, "I've seen your photos. They're really good. Would you consider using them for our new brochure?" I was surprised and flattered. Luke's lessons had paid off, but I never imagined my photos would be used professionally. This was a new chapter for me. In addition to my administrative duties, I began documenting life at the diving center, photographing diverse, vibrant fish and coral reefs. Each shot reminded me of life's beauty and surprise. Months passed, and I realized I no longer wanted to return to Paris. My life here, simple yet fulfilling, made me happier than I could have ever imagined. One evening, sitting on the beach, watching the sunset, I took out my phone and dialed my former boss in Paris. "Hello, Jean-Pierre," I said when he answered. "I hope it's okay to call." "Emily," he exclaimed. "What a pleasure to hear from you. How's your trip going?" I took a deep breath. "That's what I wanted to talk to you about. I don't think I'll be coming back to Paris." There was silence on the other end. "I see," he finally said. "Are you sure?" "Yes," I replied, surprised by my own certainty. "I found something here, a life that fits me." "I know it's unexpected, but—" "Emily," he gently interrupted, "you don't need to explain. I'm happy for you. You deserve this happiness." His words touched me deeply. After hanging up, I sat long, contemplating the ocean and reflecting on my journey.